Mr. Mike Selby, how are we, sir?
Very good, Mr. Matthew Gordon.
Glad to hear it. Now, you look, judging by your background, you look like you're on the road again.
I am in
Where are
Korea.
you? What are you up
Yes,
to?
I am in Korea.
Korea.
Yes, talking
Fantastic.
other members of the battery supply chain. So who want some nice, clean green nickel. So, yep, it's going well.
Nice, clean, green nickel. That is what we want to hear. Now, no, they want it. The price movements in the market tell us that it's people aren't quite back there yet. So what's going on?
Yeah, so it's been almost 3 weeks since we had our last chat, and obviously in the middle of that, the big orange monster in the White House in the U.S., the deal maker, did the big deal to get with China, and tariffs are back to where they were before Liberation Day. So that caused a pop in the nickel price. So again, Liberation Day, we broke through the bottom of the range that we had been in for quite a while. Shortly after that, we popped back up to it, but we're now back into that 15,000 to 15,800 range where we spent the bulk of the sort of the bottom half of 2024 and into early 2025. And again, just the bulk of it sitting just above $7 a pound or in the 15,500 level. What's been interesting is over the last few weeks, we've seen exchange inventories drop. So again, despite all this talk about surpluses, we're starting to see exchange inventories drop. One thing I've talked about a bunch is ore prices in Indonesia. And again, we've seen them over that 3-week period tick up. Philippines ticked up a couple weeks, and the last week just came off a little bit. But the key piece here is, again, ore prices now in Indonesia and Philippines are close to 3-year highs. And so, 2-year highs. And so, that is really putting pressure on some segments of supply. And again, we'll see as the year goes on whether, how much Indonesia, tries to tighten the screws on ore supply and push prices higher. The only segment we haven't seen that kind of strength is in the lower grade ore, that's the limonite ore that's used for HPAL, because we had that massive plant failure in Morowali, where we talked about the tailing stem failure, and that plant had been shut during that time period. But again, what we should see is marginal NPI producers in China get shut down, and we'll see, how Indonesia goes through the rest of the year. But, in terms of our theory for this year, so far so good in terms of, what's happening.
Okay, so I think most people are kind of concerned that we're never going to see this 20,000 range around the 20,000 mark again. What gives you confidence that we will start moving in that direction in the latter part of this year?
Yeah, it's really, again, it's in Indonesia's interest. Nickel and stainless steel are a major export for Indonesia, and so the country as a whole, individual businesses as a whole, make more money at 18 than they do at 15, and so with ore prices, at these relatively high levels versus where they were over the past few years. Again, I think that's the first step. We'll see how the rest of the year goes. But again, it's in Indonesia's interest to move nickel prices higher. They have, control of 2/3 of global supply. So they have the ability to push that higher. So we'll see how that happens through the rest of the year.
Right. And what are the mechanisms available to them, though? Okay, they got 2/3 of production, but there's a big kind of Chinese in terms of ultimate ownership in there as well. So not in China's interest to push those prices up. So how does that battle work out? And who eventually is the winner?
Yeah, so they have the RKAB process, which are effectively mining licenses, which allow you to mine certain quantities. That being said, there are certain mining regulations and environmental regulations, of which at any point in time, a certain proportion of producers are violating. So if they can't restrict the number of licenses that are out there, they can just enforce the regulations. And so over the last few years, we've seen several, ore availability squeezes happen as they clamp down for environmental or mining reasons in the region. And so that's how I think if we don't see prices continue to move higher, you'll see something like that emerge, through the balance of the year as a way to limit ore availability.
Right. And what do you think, so more, I guess more globally, what do you think the other kind of levers that are available to kind of that are not levers. It sounds like manipulation at that point. What are the other kind of drivers for the industry and the sector? So obviously stainless steel is a kind of big component of that. Some people want the prices up, if you're selling it, and other buyers, they won't want that. So again, what's that tension look like?
Yeah, so the key piece there is demand wise. So a key stat over the last few weeks that's come out, 300 series stainless production, which is the main nickel grades in China. That's up 12% for the first 4 months of the year over year, and that's a big number. Again, most analysts are in the mid to high single digit range, and that one segment is probably close to between 1/3 and 1/2 of global nickel consumption. So that's moving along pretty well. We're seeing decent demand on the EV sector. Again, I think nickel use in EV batteries just came out as well, and that's seen again in the 10 to 15% year over year range. So if you've got the two of the major segments growing at that kind of rate, that'll help underpin demand growth going forward. Which again we've asserted multiple times here that most analysts underestimate the amount of underlying nickel demand, and based on this rate we should trend up towards the high single digits for this year.
Right. Okay. And what else is happening in China in terms of because everyone that we talk to about nickel, they go, well, it's down to the Chinese, it's down to the Indonesians, they control everything. I mean, how do you think the US China tariff deal actually looks for them? Because I think it was like a couple of days afterwards, I think you had the Chinese complaining about US chip manufacturers not sticking to the basic premise and outline of the deal. Do you see this thing sticking?
Oh, in terms of I mean, I think that the Chinese the US has realized that tariffs aren't good for their economy and the global economy. And so, have been, since that one deal with China, have been walking it back on other fronts. So, again, I think you'll continue to see them walk stuff back. And then, in terms of fundamental, Chinese economics, since Liberation Day, we saw a big sell-off, a day or two after that. But since then, we've seen both the stainless prices and nickel sulfate prices in China continue to grind higher. And that points to, decent underlying demand strength. As I've said, the Chinese stainless price is always a good indicator of where where the overall nickel market is, and those are coming back quite nicely from that Liberation Day sell-off. A week or two ago, there's some crazy rumors around the Philippines banning. They've talked about an ore ban in the future, similar to what Indonesia did, but they're talking about it happening mid-year. Don't think that. I can't see that happening. It doesn't make any sense. Those rumors have died, thankfully. But again, in a country, if you basically put that in place sooner, and then you cut some of your buddies' exemptions, it's a nice way to spread favors. So that is one of the challenges in the developing world is underlying levels of corruption. And so, if there are mechanisms that, allow corruption to happen, that could be the case. But again, this floated around a week or two ago and haven't seen much since. So I think it's going to fade away at this point.
Right. Okay. Looking all a bit complicated over there in the Far East, it seems. How do companies in the West take advantage of that? And obviously, we caught up last week in London. You were kind of getting balance sheets sorted out, moving your project forward, or projects forward, I should say. So for you, how do you look at the horizon?
No, for us, I mean, again, underlying demand wise, car makers want clean green nickel, stainless companies and steel companies want access to lower carbon steel products, and that demand hasn't changed at all, and there are very few options on that front. So we're having pretty fruitful discussions. During this time frame, we talked about on the just specifically at the company in our discussion last week around, we closed a BT Capital bridge loan. We will close the TTN financing finally. It's taken a long time, but it's great to have the First Nations community use their capital to invest in the company, and that should close finally this week. And yeah, so we're in good stead on that front, and with all of the Trump noise in the market, it's really pushed the Canadian government to focus on critical minerals even more, and we should be the beneficiary of some of the newly announced funding programs that are in place for sure.
Okay. Well, and look, and what about, we better sort of talk about some of the others playing out here. So Talon Metals back in the news.
Oh, tremendous. Kudos to Talon Metals. Honestly, these are one of the, having been in the nickel business for 20 plus years, these are, some of the best drill intervals that I've ever seen. They are a little bit deep, but they are, pretty spectacular. So 8 meters of massive sulfide grading 12% nickel, almost 14% copper, and 18 grams of, platinum group metals plus gold. This would rival the best intervals that you would see at the Norilsk deposit in Russia. Again, one drill hole does not a deposit make. They stepped out about 68 meters from that hole and got another interval of massive sulfides assays pending there. But it's again great to see some good new nickel discoveries and this kind of structure. We'll see how big it is, but great, spectacular, good exploration, to be able to unlock that. And again, if there's a system in place that generates those kind of grades, what they'll be doing is borehole EM to try and understand what the size of that stuff looks like. And so, hopefully over the next few weeks, they can describe to the market what the size of some of those targets look like, and then follow up with some more drilling. So yeah, again, kudos to Talon on those results.
And EV Nickel as well.
Yeah.
The company which did particularly well last year. They just put out PEA.
Yeah. So one of our neighbors in Timmins, their Carlang deposit, again, PEA, $1.5 billion NPV, cash costs of just over $4 US, and producing about 80 million pounds a year on average over a 20-year mine life. I think the key thing here is, with ultramafic deposits, it's all about the mineralogy and mineral processing. You can have a 0.2% nickel interval where you can get 70% recovery, and you can have a 0.2 nickel interval where you can get 0% recovery. So, they haven't put out a lot of news releases on that. So it'll be interesting to look at, what's there in the technical report that'll come out 45 days from the announcement. So it should be in another 35 or 40 days. So we'll keep an eye on that. But again, good to see more nickel projects advancing in what we think is going to be the world's largest district there. And then on another ultramafic front, that seems to be one of the few places where you are seeing some activity in the nickel space. So First Atlantic Nickel, which has an ultramafic in Newfoundland, put out another hole. It was a 400-meter step out. Again, grades in the similar, most ultramafics are between 0.2 and 0.3. So 0.223% nickel. They're targeting a warite in there. So we'll have to see what the Davis tube recoverable, it's the magnetic fraction of that looks like. And they've said that they'll be, publishing those results from a couple of those holes over the next week. But again, good to see them stepping out. But it'll be the Davis tube numbers that are the key ones from there, which are coming down the pipe.
And what about in the US? Anything happening there? With obviously, we've been speaking to a lot of CEOs who are super excited about the pace at which the Trump administration is moving for North American projects across all metals, precious and battery. Any news coming out of there?
Yeah. So one of the shifts with Trump in there is this sort of Fast 41 transparency projects list. So where they're looking at identifying projects that should be fast tracked through permitting. There's a big structure through Minnesota where there's multiple nickel, copper, PGM deposits that are there that have been known since the 1960s. And again, have really struggled largely due to permitting. And so it was good to see, one of those deposits, the North Met one, which I think is a Tech Glencore joint venture, get added to that list. And you're seeing those things get added in a number of places in the U.S. So, we'll have to see how those things progress. Again, on the geopolitics front, Indonesia, Chinese have done well in Indonesia. Other companies, maybe not so much. LG, had announced a deal about 5 years back to with a consortium to look at producing downstream nickel products in Indonesia. They basically just pulled out of that, and now YU Cobalt is stepping in potentially as a partner into that project. So Again, just highlighting that Indonesia is maybe not the easiest, most straightforward place to do business if you're trying to do it as a non-Chinese company. So
right, but neither is Canada, by the sounds of it. Last time we spoke last week, Honda just pulled out of EV production
well, they didn't pull out;
in Ontario.
They just delayed
Delayed.
their Alliston plant in terms of EV sales. I think part of it is
right.
It was probably one part EV sales. Again, EV sales globally, the latest data for the month end April is still 20% plus year to date.
Right.
North America was the laggard. It was only up 5% in that time period. But I think it was more just, what? We're just going to wait and see what happens with Trump before we commit to investing $15 billion, just in case we end up on the wrong side of the tariff wall. And, as poor Beyonce and Bruce Springsteen have found out, if you say mean things to Trump, he'll come after you and sue you. So I'm sure Honda didn't want to say, we're delaying this because of tariffs. So they've just said EV sales.
It's true. They like Honda want to keep hold of their money.
Yes.
Yeah. But how do you read this, right? So we talk regularly about all the things which are happening, obviously clearly within the triumvirate of China, Philippines, Indonesia. It does seem to drive, obviously, a lot of the sentiment in the marketplace. Most of the production comes out of there. Then we also talk about the kind of West's approach to going out and finding nickel of a certain size, which may be relevant, and secure their own supply in the coming years. But the market seems disinterested. It's all kind of like uranium. It's just all focused on this LME price of nickel at the moment, not moving near that 20,000 mark. Do you think the setup? Do you think industry? I mean, I think we had the pleasure of meeting with some of the industry players last week in London. Do you think industry's excited in terms of the setup for how the West will respond, can respond? How do you read it? Because it's as a retail investor, you're kind of like, man, this is never ending. We seem to be.
Yep.
It's hard work out there.
Yeah.
What would you say?
No, but I think, the one thing that has happened, we've seen more and more measures, more incentives from government. Again, in Canada, Ontario, with the change of government, you will start to see the money come. And I think that's the part of it that investors need to. I know it's been painful in a lot of different commodities, but for critical minerals where China currently dominates, the governments want projects to go ahead. Industrial consumers of those products in the West want those projects to go ahead. Those are the conversations that we're having today with companies much larger than us, because they want access to safe, clean sources of those minerals. And so it's not a if but a when. And again, it's been painful, but I think once we start to see a few more of those projects get over the line, you're going to start to people will go, okay, this is how it's going to work. And okay, if this is a meaningful source of this material in a place where you can actually build the mine, and then you've got a team that actually can take it through and get it to construction and then ultimately into production, those assets are going to go through a significant re-rate.
Yeah. Okay. So, and because I think the thing that's kind of interesting to me about the market as a whole, this is not nickel only comment. This is about the way the markets had to adapt and change, or so the companies within the market have had to adapt and change, and source alternative financing. Alternative financing is very different today to what it was like certainly when I was back in banking.
Yeah,
where you've had to think of ways of attracting different capital, which isn't one dilutory, because the sorts of money. I mean, take your company for example. You're in the process of having raised hundreds of millions of bucks. I've got commitments of hundreds of millions of bucks for a project for a company of your size, which I think would have been, I guess, unfathomable and impossible. So in my banking days, do you think that industry, that strategic, that kind of government money kind of coming in will become the new norm for big projects in the West?
100%. Again, it's one of those. there's often times where sort of financing structures emerge, and and then all of a sudden, the first one or two, it's like, oh, okay, that's a new recipe, and then within 3 years, people go, oh, okay, that's the recipe, right? And you see 12 projects get done with that same recipe, right? In the 1990s, it was you could be a junior developer, you advanced a project, to feasibility study. You went to your Japanese or Korean trading house. They came in and bought 20 to 30% of the project. That gave you 100% of your equity check. They would provide all the debt financing, and away you went, right? And so that was the recipe that worked in this time frame. I think we're still, the ingredients are all there. I think you just need to see one cake come out of the oven and go, oh, okay, that's the way it works. So
I think that's right. And I said it's not even just a nickel comment. This is
cross.
and not even just a battery comment. We're seeing this having to work within gold companies as well. Gold selling off their copper component to fund the build to access the gold revenue, which they hope to. So it's kind of, and I'm talking about a Canadian company, that instance, Troilus Gold, which I think did a fantastic, or has done a fantastic setup for allowing them to do that. Right, interesting times. Well, Mark, I appreciate it. I know it's late there in Korea, so better let you get your beauty sleep. And we look forward to hearing all about it when you get back home.
Sounds good, sir. Take care.